Alright, so I think this is everything we're going to be using to run power and ground up to the radio. This is just your standard 3-pin connector. This is for the radio I'm going to be running right now. My whole plan behind this is to future-proof, so when I throw another radio, I'm going to be able to throw something bigger or change out, switch out things, any of my radios, or add an amplifier. But to me, this is the minimum acceptable setup for running a solid power and ground, which is extremely important to have a proper radio setup. So just to go over everything real quick, this is your standard 3-pin for the radio that I'm going to be using. What I did was I took the connector and the cord that came with, like this. I don't know if it came with the radio. I have a bunch of them in my garage, but it's the style that comes with the radio. And what I did was I just I cut it maybe 3-4 inches. I stripped everything back. Then I took this 12 gauge OFC speaker wire and then ran it to Anderson connector. If you're not familiar with how these work, basically they have these lugs in there. You see those lug terminals inside? You either crimp or solder those onto each side, and you just push it in there, and there's a little tab in there, if you can see behind it, that clicks it in place. And then that way you can take this to your other side of whatever you're using and just snap it in. As you can see, they're marked positive and negative. Positive and negative. So I made this little pigtail so that I didn't feel like it was all the way necessary to run 8 gauge. I could have just soldered 8 gauge to this connector, but I feel like this is sufficient. And one of the most important things to remember anytime you're running power and ground wire for this type of thing. Another one of my hobbies is car audio, so this goes for that kind of equipment too. You always want to be running OFC, oxygen free copper. Don't try to go cheap on your wiring, especially when it comes to CB, ham radio, these type of things. It's more wise to get more expensive wiring and cabling and go with cheaper equipment if you have to, because when it comes to radio equipment, especially in a vehicle, in a mobile application, it's far more important to have proper installation as far as power and ground, coax, antenna studs, mounts, and tuning the antenna. All that stuff is 90% of your system. The radio is probably the least important part of the whole system. So if you're not going to do it correctly, there's literally no point in spending the hundreds of dollars to get a real cool radio if you're not going to put in the extra work and get the proper stuff. So this stuff isn't cheap OFC wiring, but it's not expensive either. The brand I use that I've been using for years is, you can see here, Sky High Car Audio. This one says Sky High Car Audio Twisted OFC 8 gauge AWG power cable. Right, so this is 8 gauge, this is 12 gauge. As you can see, it says, focus, Sky High Car Audio premium oversized OFC 12 gauge AWG speaker wire. OFC is very important. It's oxygen-free copper. You do not want to go with a CCA wire. If you go with the cheap stuff, that's what it's going to be, copper-clad aluminum. If it doesn't say OFC, then it's not OFC. There's plenty of brands. You can go with Stinger, New Concepts, welding cable. There's all kinds of brands. This is just my preferred. It's priced fair. It's really good wire. It's oversized. Let's see if I can show you here. So this is an 8 gauge. If I can get a good angle. Sorry, I'm just using my phone. I don't know if that's going to focus. Anyways, you can see that a lot of times if you go with cheaper wire, it'll look like it's the same diameter on the outside, but the insulator, the jacket, will be super thick, and the wire inside will be not the proper size. This is oversized, so this is going to be thicker than standard 8 gauge. The actual conductor in the wire is going to be more strands than your typical standard 8 AWG cabling. Same goes for all of their stuff. That's why I go with them. It's very flexible wire too. It's just my preference. Some people have different preference. Like I said, go with any brand as long as it's OFC, oxygen free copper. So yeah, I took that. I just cut it and stripped back this 3-pin connector, soldered this 12 gauge on this side, put these are called Anderson connectors. These ones are designed specifically for 8 gauge. I made this work. I just soldered these connections in here, and then these ones I crimped. So these are good for up to 8 gauge. If you're gonna go more than 8 gauge, you get the next size up, which is gonna be a lot bigger, and it's gonna be designed for a 4 gauge wire. If you're gonna be running a big radio, something 500 watts, you're gonna want to go with a 4 gauge wire. I was gonna go 4 gauge, but 4 gauge is actually just a pain in the ass. Having two 4 gauge wires ran all the way up in a company truck, you have to make a lot of room. You have to modify some things to make room to run 2 large 4 gauge cables all the way from the battery. So I'm just not gonna. I'll go with a smaller radio this time instead of putting something like my Ranger 63 FFC4. I'm not gonna run that in this truck. If I was, then I will be running 4 gauge power and ground. So we got the 12 gauge with the connector, and the reason I did it like this, that I wanted to set it up like this, is so that I could just make these pigtails for any radio. If I wanted to run a radio with a 6-pin cable, I could just make a 6-pin cable like this and put this connector on it, and then I have one for 3-pin, one for 6-pin, whatever. Later on down the line, I'm going to be putting a radio that just has an Anderson connector on it. So if you're running a bigger radio like my Ranger 63 FFC4, it has this type of connector on the power connector coming from the radio. So this will plug straight into there. So yeah, that's why I did that. So we got the 12 gauge with the Anderson connector. This is 8 gauge. So I'm gonna be running this all the way from the battery, and I'm gonna ground to the ground posts on the frame of the truck under the hood. So obviously this is way more wire than I need. I think this is about 25 feet. But I'm gonna cut it to pretty much exact size. I'm gonna give myself a little room, but I put the connector on for now. I left the other ends bare. I'm gonna run that down, then cut it to size. Then I'm gonna be using these terminal connectors. This is a, let's see, 5/16. So see, it's made for, these are called ring terminals or lugs, right? Cable lugs. So as you can see, so they're made for 8 gauge and the hole is 5/16. So the hole in the lug itself is 5/16. This is going to be for the battery connection. I'm pretty sure last time I did it, 5/16 is the correct size. So you need to get the correct size lug for the size wire, and then you need to get the correct hole for the stud that you're going to be using on the battery. Studs, I believe, are 5/16. These ones are 8 gauge with a 3/8, and that 3/8 hole is going to fit on the ground posts underneath the hood. These are cool little ones. They come from Amazon. They're pretty good. I had good luck with them, and they come with this heat shrink, and it is marine grade adhesive lined heat shrink. That's very important. Anytime you're going to be using heat shrink, it's going to be outside or under the hood or in the elements, inside a cab or inside the cabin of your vehicle, car, truck, whatever it's not as important, but I always like to use marine grade adhesive lined heat shrinks. And this is, I believe, 3-to-1. Yeah, 3-to-1 industrial heat shrink tubing. That means it's gonna shrink down to 3 times smaller than the size it is now. So it'll give a nice tight connection. It won't be loose. So there's that. So once I get this all ran and I get it cut down to size, I'm gonna put these, one for the ground, it's gonna go to the frame, the other one to the battery. But you also need to fuse your connection. So what I'm gonna use is a breaker. I like to use a breaker because, number one, I just hate those little clear fuses. In my car audio, like in my car, I run breakers too. I just hate those little clear fuse holders for whatever. I feel like this gives a solid connection. So what you would do here is you would put a terminal, let's see, comes with terminals. You would make a wire and crimp these on or solder them on, and then that will go from the battery directly onto here, then another side from here. And the reason I like to use a breaker also is, like I said, number one, I hate those clear fuse holders. I just don't like them. I feel like there's too many chance for an improper connection or something like that. Also, they look kind of janky. It doesn't look like something that came with the car. My whole goal for any time I do a setup, especially on a company vehicle, is to try to make it look like it came like that. I want it to be able to roll into the shop and nobody's none the wiser. They couldn't tell what I got going on. So this is going to look proper. I'm going to mount this somewhere in the battery box. I'm going to have a short run of wire going from the positive battery terminal to here, and then the rest of the wire from here, or obviously not the black one, but this power coming from here all the way up to where the radio's at. Another reason I like to do this too is because you could turn it off. You could just pop the breaker and do some work. You don't have to worry about having a live wire. You can do the same thing with the fuse holder too, but you would have to remove the fuse. Whereas this, I could just push a button. Like if I'm not going to be at work on Monday and they're going to have some doofus in my truck, I could just pop this and they won't even be able to use my radio. So another little trick I like to do is just use a breaker. This is a 50 amp breaker. You want to use the proper fuse for the wire, not for the device. So the radio that I'm running might only need a 15 amp fuse. But if I were to put a 15 amp fuse down by the battery, I would be maxing out that fuse. So you want to use the proper breaker or fuse size for the ampacity or amp capacity of your wire. Now, this 8-gauge wire and the length I'm going to be using it for is good for 50 amps. So I'm going to put a 50 amp breaker. That way it's cruising along. If I were to put a smaller breaker that would be more in line with the device I'm going to be using, then you would be overheating. You want to have some headroom, basically. You want to have better, you want to have some headroom available so that you're not running your breaker or your fuse as close as it will go without popping, because that'll be running hot. So if you want, I'm not going to on this particular build, but if you want, you can run a separate fuse up here by your radio. Me personally, I'm not going to do that. If you feel it's necessary, by all means. But for this setup, I'm just going to be running this down by the battery with as short of a run from the battery to here as I can. So I'm going to find a proper place to mount this closest to where I'm going to be hooking up to the battery as I possibly can. Because you don't want to have the fuse up by the radio or so far away, because if something happens between the battery and here, you know, that's recipe for disaster. So there's that. And then of course, if you're going to be using these style of connectors, you're going to have to use a proper crimper. This will suffice. I've used this style up until 0 gauge. If you're going to go more than that, I would get like a hydraulic crimper. But especially for 8 gauge, what we're doing, these are pretty cheap. You can get these on Amazon for like, I don't know, $17 or $20. But it's good for 0 gauge. So, and it works. I've used it on 0 gauge. It does work. You can't, for this style of connectors, you can't just crimp this on by hammering it, or, you know, using vice grips or putting it in a vise or something like that. You're going to end up with a bad connection. So either solder it like I did here, because I soldered it because these wires are too small to be crimped into these lugs that go in here. On this side, I crimped it because the wire is a perfect fit. It's an oversized wire, so it fits perfectly snug inside the lug, and then I just crimped it. So use a proper crimper. Use all proper copper, right? These are all, everything here is copper, oxygen-free copper. That's the key. Yeah, and if I forgot anything, I'll go over it again once we get out to the truck. But this is everything we're going to be using to run power and ground from the battery up to the radio.